Hi, everybody. I am about to start another, there we go, a little bit better lit WebTeach on some of the concepts that we're going to be going over this week. I figured I'd do this in addition. Sorry, that was my dog moving my screen around. I figured I'd do this in addition to the Christopher Flynn notes that you're all going to be looking at, so that some of these more foreign concepts will make a little bit more sense. So for the majority of this WebTeach, I'm going to have it on share screen so that you can see the notes that I have in front of me and I can explain them a little bit better for you. So I will go into share screen mode in a moment. A couple of things, and you'll see this when I get to share screen, but before I start, if you haven't already read, highlight, annotated the class handout on post-colonialism definitions that you can find on Canvas, please do so before you watch the rest of this, because otherwise it's not going to make any sense. The other thing is I posted a first WebTeach that's actually not me. It's Dr. Christopher Flynn out of the University of Texas at Austin, and he is teaching these general concepts related to post-colonial theory in a nice, straightforward to the point overview. This video is just here to kind of elaborate on some of those ideas that we might need a little more time on, because this is a new field of theory to us. So again, read, highlight, annotate, define unfamiliar words from the post-colonialism definitions handout, and then make sure you watch the YouTube link that I put on Canvas from Dr. Christopher Flynn. Both of those can be found under week 10 module, by the way, and then start watching this. So I'm going to go into a share screen, and I'm going to explain what we have going on here in terms of the WebTeach, so that this makes a little bit more sense to you. I already went over 1 and 2, so just keep that in mind, right? Read the handout first, and then watch the Flynn video, and then watch this WebTeach. That's going to make the most sense. Otherwise, some of what I talk about is not going to make a lot of sense in this video. So we'll start with this idea of post-colonial theory. If you recall, the last unit that we did was on issues related to gender theory. It wasn't all of gender theory, right? That would be like an entire lifetime of study, but just some issues related to gender theory. So in the same way, the unit that we're starting this week, sorry, those are my dogs. The unit that we'll be beginning this week is on post-colonial theory. And like gender theory, it's a way of seeing the world, and it specifically focuses on power relationships. But this time, the power relationships are not gender related, they're related to this idea of the colonizer and the colonized, or what is now kind of considered the former colonizer and the formerly colonized, in the 21st century. So keeping that in mind, we're going to go over, I'm going to just add some scaffolding notes to some of the things that Flynn talks about so that they make a little bit more sense. And also that they'll make those post-colonialism definitions make a little more sense. And we can apply them to the text that we're looking at, such as Kincaid's A Small Place, such as the film District 9, and some of the readings that we'll have the week we come back from break. So the first theorist that Flynn talks about is Edward Sayid. He's kind of the granddaddy of post-colonial theory. He's since passed, and well, bragging rights, I did get to see him 6 months before he passed away when I was a student myself in college, which was, for a nerd like me, that's like meeting Yeezy for the rest of you, basically. So really big name in post-colonial theory, if not the biggest name. He coined the term Orientalism, and Orientalism is a whole text, a whole series of texts in which he talks about a variety of things. But essentially what he's talking about is how the West, has controlled an image of the East. And Sayid is Palestinian, and he is specifically concerned with what is known as the Middle East, the Orient, which would be East Asia and Southeast Asia, and Northern Africa. So he is not necessarily looking at places like Latin America or at indigenous populations in North America or in Australia. He's really focusing on the West being Europe and the East being those places I mentioned, North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So he talks about how the West or the Occident constructs this vision of the East. And that vision we come to see is very dehumanizing, right? It's a very unflattering or exoticized, one-dimensional rendering of people, of cultures, of, essentially anything from the East. And his focus is British literature, particularly from the Victorian period. But there are plenty of examples that we can see into this day of the West essentially sort of constructing this very dehumanizing vision of the East. Some in the 20th century, like the sort of buck-toothed Asian immigrant, right, was like a popular one in film and television in America. But he goes back even further, right, to 19th century England and talks about how the East is very dehumanized in a variety of ways. And that East is otherwise known as the Orient in Sayid's theoretical lexicon. So keep that in mind. And why is this done, right? Why does the West represent the East in this sort of exotic or dehumanized or even sort of threatening or dangerous way? If we think back to the immediate follow-up to 9/11 of American culture, right? The way that people from the Middle East or Muslim cultures were treated was in a completely one-dimensional and dehumanizing way. And we have plenty of examples of those from our own recent history, right? Really, the reason why this is all done, according to Sayid, is to achieve or reinforce a notion of Western dominance, right? The West is somehow superior or better or stronger or more powerful or more righteous or sort of more correct, right, than these other cultures. And so Sayid is looking at these specific cultures. Again, he's talking about Europe versus Asia, Middle East, Northern Africa. But this can really be applied to any colonized or colonized relationship when we look at post-colonial theory in the 21st century. So that's Sayid. The next person that Flynn talks about is Gayatri Spivak. And Gayatri Spivak has an incredibly famous essay called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" It's what she's most known for. And Spivak essentially in this essay takes gender and she takes post-colonial theory and she sort of blends the two in a very effective way. She talks about the subaltern, and as you'll see from your notes, the subalterns, this is not her term that she coins. If I said that, I'm sorry. She doesn't coin the term. It's not as if it has never been used before. She actually takes it from Antonio Gramsci, who is an Italian theorist. But she applies this idea of the subaltern to her understanding of Indian society, because she herself is from India. And she's talking about, in terms of the subaltern, and we're here now, she's talking about the people who essentially are the furthest away from power in a given society, okay? So we can think about, right, if we do the same thing with Spivak that we did with Sayid, which is now kind of take it out of the original place and expand it to all of these discussions of post-colonial theory and power throughout the world, we can think of our own society and we can ask ourselves, perhaps, right, who are the subalterns in our society? Who are the people based on any number of things, right? Race, class, gender, ability status, age, veteran status, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, sexuality, right? Who are the people that are the furthest from power in our society? And, you know, I've heard a number of arguments being made one way or another that are really compelling. So we can talk about that at a later date. But thinking about the subaltern in Spivak, right? Oh, excuse me. She's very concerned with their voice, and not like, oh, you know, like not their singing voice, but how, if they are heard by those in power or by anyone who has more power than they do in a given society. And so she talks about these things called speech acts, right? So if we think about that, what I just said about voice, right? If we're talking about a voice as something symbolic, right? Your political voice when you get to vote, or your voice in society based on how much money you have, or how famous you are, or how much access to power you have, then a speech act is not necessarily just talking, but it's any action or piece of writing or speech or behavior that allows us to express ourselves and express our autonomy being, you know, the extent to which we can enact change or we can have an effect on the world. So she talks about these ideas of speech acts, right? And sometimes those speech acts can be acts of resistance, in that, you know, if I you know, live in an oppressive society and I vote out an oppressive ruler, right? Or if I you know, am experiencing some sort of oppression because of who I am, right? And I actively work against that oppression, right? Those would be considered speech acts because I'm expressing myself in a sort of political or socio-political way. The subalterns, in terms of political, social, and cultural representation, right, lack those things. They're the furthest from them. And so the goal to Spivak is how do we not just get the subaltern to speak, right, in the symbolic sense, but to be heard, to be acknowledged by the other members of a society who have more power. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking Spivak. And then the third one that we'll look at is Homi Bhabha. And this one's important because this includes a definition that will be on the midterm, but that is only referenced on the handout. So this is where you find out to a greater extent than what Flynn talks about what this term means. And that term is mimicry. We're right here now. So mimicry occurs when the dominated culture, in other words, the colonized culture, when we're talking about post-colonial theory, attempts to mimic the colonizer or the dominant culture. And as you heard in the video, this is an attempt to sort of express a reformed, recognizable other. In other words, you know, the immigrant or the person from a colonized society who exists in a Western culture and is trying to assimilate, right? Is trying their best to look and act and behave and speak like the members of that dominant Western culture as much as they possibly can, so that they can be somehow correct, right? Somehow they are, you know, doing it right, for lack of a better term. Unfortunately, according to Bhabha, one of the aims of mimicry is slippage, which is essentially like a failure, right? A failure to be perfectly like the dominant culture, either by saying things with a heavy accent or not quite getting the customs or the dress of that dominant culture. And by failing, right, that is a reinforcement the power of that dominant culture. Like an example that comes to my mind from my own personal experience is when I was young, I grew up in Santa Ana and Westminster, and a majority of my friends were Vietnamese American. Their parents had come over, endured, you know, a brutal, horrific war, and then had come over to America, a lot of them as refugees, and established a new life here. And so my friends were the children of those people who had technically been born in America, most of which had been born in America. Some had still been born in Vietnam and had come over, right, as part of this large sort of cultural migration. And I remember my friends would say things to me like, oh, you know, my cousin or this person I know is such a FOB, right, FOB. And that stood for fresh off the boat. As if, right, not having fully assimilated or fully understanding or fully acting American, right, was some sort of character flaw. And it wasn't until years later, you know, we kind of were adults and realized that that wasn't the only way that people could live, that it was seen that that wasn't probably the kindest or the most you know, the most open-minded of ways of responding to people. And in fact, right, it's a perfect example of this reestablishment of the dominance of that colonizing culture, right? So if that helps, right, that's kind of an example of that slippage that we're talking about. And then finally, Bhabha talks about hybridity, especially in terms of the immigrant experience, the diaspora, which is another word. It looks like diaspora, but it's pronounced diaspora in your terms. Or immigrants or members of the diaspora, they're not fully part of their culture of origin, nor are they fully immersed into the culture into which they've immigrated, right? Because, you know, they're not physically living in the place that they come from to be fully part of that culture. But they also, again, come from a different place, have grew up or experienced or learned different cultural customs. And so they're kind of in this, what is known as a liminal space, right? And think of like a doorway between two rooms. If you stand in the doorway, right? Like let's pretend my window is a doorway. If I stood in that doorway, right in the dead center of the doorway, would I be in this room or would I be outside? I wouldn't really be in either, right? I would be kind of partially in one, partially another, partially outside of both, right? And so hybridity occurs in that space where I'm not sort of fully in, you know, culturally, I'm not fully in one space or another, right? And you know, that's what Bhabha is kind of getting at when he's talking about it. But he's talking about it, again, in terms of culture and post-colonial theory and things like this. So I hope that this helps. I'm not going to belabor the point on Kincaid, on the Kincaid reading too much. But what I will say is think about
war any longer. And
think about perhaps how we can apply some of these concepts, particularly subalternity, diaspora, mimicry, post-colonialism, to our reading of Kincaid and to the film that we'll be watching this week. So keep in mind the film notes, keep in mind the definitions. All of it is on Canvas, and it's all in order of how kind of we should be doing it this week. So keep all that in mind, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Please email me, come to my virtual conference hours or our class drop-in if you have questions. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.